The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Jim Ostrowski with the DEQ's Office of Public Affairs and Outreach, and I welcome you to our webinar on calculating the generic criteria for the VIAP, summarizing it, in the proposed Part 201 rules. So today we've got a couple presenters with us from DEQ, Matt Williams and Shane Morrison, who will be speaking to us via presentation and showing us some examples on the spreadsheet here. Before I turn it over to them, I want to go over some housekeeping guidelines. We do have a lot of people attending today. We have about 600 people registered to view this webinar, so a lot of people I'm sure are joining us right now. The housekeeping guidelines are simple. All lines are muted, which means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. If you have a question during the webinar, feel free to type it into the GoToWebinar question box that you have on your toolbar there. That comes to us, and what we'll be doing is we're expecting quite a few questions. So some of the questions we'll be answering directly back to you if it's specific. Other ones we'll save to the end, and we've got some staff here that will be sorting through them and helping us summarize them, and we'll be reading those off at the end. If by chance we go a little too long and we aren't able to get to all the questions, don't worry. We have a spreadsheet that we print out with everybody that attended and which questions you asked. So if it's something that we need to get back to you on directly, we will have that available to us. We are recording the webinar and we will post it online probably next week. You'll get an email from me when that happens. Also, I sent out an email yesterday afternoon with some homework on it. Well, I think you can call it homework, but it had some references that you might want to refer to prior to viewing this webinar, as well as a copy of the presentation file and a copy of the rules. So that leads me to my first thing we're going to do today, and that is I'm going to ask a poll question of you all. And I would like you to tell us, check what's applied. We just want to know if you had a chance to look at the presentation we sent out yesterday, or if you've attended one of the public information sessions that we held throughout a couple places last year. Just quickly answer that poll question and we'll move along. Just gives us an idea for your knowledge level. Okay, I'm seeing most of you are answering, which is great. And just for those of you who have just logged in, want to let you know that you're all muted and that we are recording the presentation and we'll post it online next week, and you'll get an email from us when that happens. So it looks like most of us have responded. Close this and I will share it with you all so you can all see where we're at. So a lot of you have had some experience with this and kind of know what's going on at some level. Look how many people have read the proposed rules. That's pretty good. And a lot of people have reviewed the presentations that we provided. So that's good to see, Matt.
That is good.
All right, so what I'm going to do is turn it over to you. There you go.
Oh, thanks, Jim. Like Jim said, Shane and I will be doing the presentation today. We also have support staff in here to help answer your questions as we go through the presentation. It's awesome to see that many people actually have looked at the proposed rules as well as looked at some of the supporting documentation that's out there. That will be key as we go forward to have that general understanding because we are talking about a specific portion of the rules, and this is a detailed presentation to talk about how you can calculate those values in a tool that we're helping, that we are going to put out to help do that. As you are aware and why we're here, the volatilization indoor air pathway, it is a complex pathway that we know based on our stakeholders and based on various sessions that we've had is the best way to develop a criteria is to use facility-specific inputs. And we've identified those in the proposed rules. And with the ability to use facility-specific inputs, it allows people to develop criteria that are more appropriate for their site. The proposed rules, like when Jim sent them out this morning, you'll see on slide 3, we made the recommendation that you printed them out so that if you needed to take notes, that you could. You can see the link where they're all available if you have to come back later and get them. But the most important rule as we talk about the volatilization into our pathway is Rule 27. That's what we are going to be referencing. There are other rules that come in and out as we talk about Rule 27, and those are Rules 7, 46, 49, and 50. So our objectives today, as we go through the webinar, is to discuss how we derived the proposed generic criteria. We are going to go through and explain how the proposed rules identify the formulas. We're going to talk about the process, how you get to the VI tiers, the different tiers, how the rules and where they contain the inputs, including the facility-specific information that you need to develop a VI Tier 2 and a VI Tier 3A. We're going to go through and explain the tool that we're working on developing, and we hope to have out shortly, so that it will aid in the implementation and the calculating of the values for the VI Tier 2 and 3A. One of the things you'll find if you did read the rules is that the only values that are identified in the rules are the VI Tier 1 screening values. And that's because the VI Tier 1 relies on only a single set of assumptions, and when you get into the VI Tier 2 and the VI Tier 3A, there are multiple assumptions. Then in order to produce that amount of tables, you would have to produce over 1,000 different tables. So that's why a tool like what we're talking about today is an important component that we saw early on, and that we are, like I said, hoping to get out very shortly. The process is identified in Rule 27, Figure 1. You will notice that this figure is very similar, if you've looked at some of the supporting documentation, to what the CSA work group identified. It shows you an overview or a roadmap of the VI tiered process, and if you go through it, when you go through it, it's very helpful to have a general understanding of how the tiers relate to each other. And though we're not going to spend a lot of time or any time talking about the specifics of the VI tiered process, from a general high level, it's important to understand again that the VI Tier 1, which are the single values identified in the rules, are not the criteria. The VI Tier 1 are the generic screening levels that rely on a single set of assumptions. When we get to the VI Tier 2, we're allowed to use facility-specific inputs to establish our generic unrestricted residential criteria. So in our VI Tier 2, we are not modifying any of the building assumptions. What we are modifying is our soil types, our depth of groundwater, as well as our location in the state, which would have a direct result of our soil temperature or our system temp. And then when we look at the VI Tier 3A, this is where we would put in additional facility-specific inputs to establish generic restricted criteria, where we look at land uses, different building sizes, air exchange rates, and other components that we've already pre-identified. One of the important parts of the proposed rules is that all these values and the way that we can derive them with the different facility-specific inputs are already pre-approved, and that as long as your site conditions match those that you develop the values for, they would be appropriate in using. So the proposed rules are identified again. The volatilization of the indoor pathway is in Rule 27. That has the volatilization to indoor screening levels, the generic criteria, and the equations. The inputs to rule and outputs to Rule 27 you'll find in Rule 7, which identifies the soil type and soil temperature values. And Rule 46 is the VI Tier 1 screening values already calculated. And Rule 49 is the footnotes, and Shane will talk some about the important footnotes for the VIAP. And Rule 50 is the toxicological, the chemical specific, and the chemical physical properties that you need to complete calculating the values. The assumptions as we go through today's presentation is that you have read the VI tier process and you have a generic understanding of it. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the difference between a VI Tier 2 and a VI Tier 3A other than what we just talked about. And it's also going to assume that the site characterization is adequate. And if we go through and we change the soil type, we're changing the soil type because it is appropriate for our site. And we're not changing the soil type just because the calculator lets us, but we're changing it because we know the soil type. It was appropriately classified under the USDA classification system. We can provide the necessary supporting information to make those changes. And also, we're not going to talk about it, but the acceptable air concentrations has been calculated pursuant to the rules. So that's already been completed as well. So again, as we go through it, the VI Tier 1 is not the generic criteria. It's based on a single set of assumptions. And as you'll go through and you'll see that there are multiple variables that you have to account for that the calculator will help us do. And I think one of the main messages that we want to make sure that is clear is you don't have to be a math wizard in order to do this. The calculator will aid in helping you do all the math for you. What's going to be important is when the proposed rules are passed, is that you are able to document that your site conditions match those that you used to develop the values.
Yeah, so one of the inputs for the VIAP calculations is the acceptable air concentrations. And like most other pathways, we evaluate several health effects, carcinogenic, developmental, non-carcinogens, and the lowest of those values, the AACs, become the health-based value. And these we would consider for both residential and non-residential. Mutagenic would only be considered for residential. And one other thing that comes into play, and as Matt mentioned, I'll talk about later, it's more referenced in the footnotes, is acute values, where there's actually set values that aren't calculated based on rules or the equations in Rule 27.
All right, thanks, Shane. This is a generic roadmap of the tool and how it works. You can see on the left-hand side that it reaches out and will grab the chemical physical inputs, the building inputs that are identified in Rule 27 Table 1, as well as other values and soil inputs. And the calculator will do all the math as appropriate for the groundwater, shallow groundwater, depending on which one you have present on your site, the soil and the vapor. The important thing is again, it does the math for you. You just need to know the specific information. So if we take a look at it, what you can see is, and this is the interface that we're going to be talking about, or the calculator. It's right here. You can see that for the VI Tier 2, because it is generic unrestricted residential, it already has the inputs for the residential house with the basement filled out. You can see it has the tabs that we talked about, where the generic questions, which we're going to go through to fill in the different yellow boxes on this screen. It'll produce the results as we go through it, and we're able to fill those out. It contains all the chemical physical information that's identified in the rules. It does the calculations. Again, you're getting errors right now because we don't have the inputs on the questions. And it also identifies all the different variables you have for soil texture classifications, as well as other building pipe inputs and other things that we'll go through as we go through the presentation. So we'll come back. Again, the main components, like we just talked about, you can see that it appears in those tabs. We have the site information, or the questions that we'll complete and we'll walk through. It asks questions on the environmental conditions, the land use, and the building conditions. It goes out and identifies the chemical, toxicological, and fixed inputs, which we are calling the prime inputs for the presentation. So it goes out in the rules and it grabs that information from the tables. It does all the calculations for you. So even though you're going to see some equations there with a lot of the math, you don't have to be a math wizard to get it done. The calculations tab will follow the rules and follow the equations, fill in the inputs, and do all the calculations for you. And finally, there'll be a results tab, or the criteria tab, that identify the VI Tier 2 and the VI Tier 3A values. So here's the beginning again. This is just a screenshot of it. The first step is to input the site information. It is a required field that you do it. If you do not complete the site information, you won't get any values. You can see in the lower right-hand side, there's a thing called the form check. Until both of these boxes, or at least till a tier is complete, you will not see the values identified in the results tab. So until we see the VI tier 2 read complete, we will not be able to see any of the results appear. So the first step again that we're going to go through is we're going to enter the building type and foundation. Because the VI tier 2 is for the generic unrestricted residential, they've already been pre-inputted and they're not variables that we can change. The building information you can see down in the lower has already been incorporated into it, and those match the proposed rules. It'll also, as we go through it, provide information into things like the footings and utilities depth below grade, and other information like that that you can find in the table 1. So the calculator, when it reaches out, it goes into table 1 of rule 27.16 for the building inputs. Based on that, we'll fill in the depth of footings and the utilities below the enclosed space. You'll see it if you printed it out that each tier clearly identifies what those inputs are. It identifies the depth below grade, the length and the width, as well as the mixing height of the building, and the air exchange rates for all the pre-approved facility-specific inputs. So when we look at building type and foundation, this is a blow-up of that table 1. We have a residential house with a basement, which is the same for the VI tier 2, which is the generic unrestricted criteria. The VI tier 3A, we have additional options. So we can look at things that we may have to use a land or use restriction for, which may include, under the residential category, a high-rise apartment. But we can also look at non-residential uses as well under the VI tier 3A, that we can look at a former residential structure that's now non-residential use, which we see common in for like accounting offices or lawyers' offices. But we can also look at non-residential structures less than 50,000 square feet or greater than 50,000 square feet. And we can look at different foundation types. For not only for residential, we look at a basement or slab on grade or a basement that's uninhabitable, but we can also look at non-residential scenarios as well. The same thing happens when we look at building length and width as we go through it. The VI tier 2 gets their value similar to that of the VI tier 1, but when we go to the VI tier 3A, we can look at modifying those to match non-residential uses if that's what we're looking for. The air exchange rate is the same. You would notice that the high-rise apartment, if we selected that, we would have a different air exchange rate based on the information that we have. When we look at non-residential uses, we would also get different air exchange rates for depending on what we select as the building type. So it's already set up in the rules to do that. So when we look at the calculator that we're proposing, and I go back to the questions, what you can see here is we have a choice between the residential and non-residential. We have a choice of, for residential, the house or the high-rise. If we go back to make this non-residential, we have the choice of the 3 selections that we just talked about and the basement types. And once we do that, you can see that it's automatically, because we did a slab on grade, that it automatically puts in the depth below grade. It automatically puts in the footings and the utilities, and it also self-populates the length, the width, and the height of the building, as well as the air exchange rate. So all that's done. When we have our soil information, we would be putting in it as the soil type verification, the methods that we do, and we'll look at how it populates the parameters as well as some of the other cells that will help us populate. When we look at the proposed rules in Rule 3, or Rule 7, Sub-Rule 3, I to V, it is how we determine the selection of the USDA soil type. There are 5 options, again, I to V. That allows us to identify what soil type we can use based on how we collected the information. And the US, in the classification that we would use, again, is the USDA soil classification. So it was previously identified under some of the former proposed rules as a visual observation. The language just changed a little bit. But you would get these four main classifications. The field methods would include using things like the soil texturing field flow chart, which has it identified, as well as using field sieves to the point that you could. And what happens is in Rule 7, when we know what our soil texture is or our soil type, it allows us to possibly change something from where we assume it for being generic unrestricted for the sand to moving that to the parameter or to the inputs that are more appropriate for a different soil type. Like in this case, we've shown how it would move from sand to loam. And it would automatically make those modifications behind the scenes in the equations for you. So looking at how this works and self-populates, again, soil type verification, when we know that we have those 5 methods, the 3 that we can do out in the field are right here. If you look at IV and V, those are using for other materials for beneficial use as well as condition for bedrock. So that those wouldn't apply here. But you could always use unknown to get that. But if we select unknown, you can see that we get a choice of 1 soil type, where if we choose the field methods that we talked about, the approved field methods, you would get the choice of 4. And though it says lab methods, the rules say other methods approved by the DEQ, and there might be other ones that we have identified for using the lab methods. But if you have that, you get the choice of all the USDA soil classification systems. When you pick the soil type, it automatically will carry it over to the VI Tier 3A. Plus, it automatically fills in the values and reaches out and obtains those out of the chart. So you don't have to look it up. It's already provided. It calculates the capillary zone for you. And that'll be important when we get to the separation distance for the groundwater, but it automatically calculates it out. So you can see, based on your soil type, how that cap zone changes. So we can go through and we can make different soil types if they're appropriate for our site again, and you can see how the values and the parameters would change as well as the cap zone. And I'm trying to go slow enough to make sure that the lag doesn't get too far behind, which is why I'm trying to make sure that it's going slow enough. So going back to the temperature would be the final box that we'd have to do, and that we would pick by county, and it'll put in our system temp automatically. The temperature is identified by county. If you've attended the information sessions, you know that this table that's available in Table 2 of Rule 7, Subrule 4, is based on data that we got in collaboration with MSU throughout the state. So it's Michigan-specific data. It's based on a centroid value for the county. But basically, if you pick the county, it will self-populate that system temp for you. So again, you can see Calcas as an example. We'll go over to the calculator. So all you need to know for the system temp is what county you are in. It automatically will populate if you're in Ottawa County, if you're in Midland County. It'll automatically change that temperature. You can see here in the system temp how it changes that system temp for you. And again, all these values are values that you would identify, that are identified in the proposed rules. The final thing, which you would find in rules 27 and 7, is the depth of groundwater. And this is a key one that'll finish the population, or finish populating some of the blank cells that we have here. But one of the key things that the groundwater will identify for us is the separation distance. And though there are 3 separation distances identified in the rules, the one we're specifically talking about is the vertical separation distance identified in Rule 27.1L. And that is, the vertical separation distance is the lesser of either I or double I. And that's important to understand, and I'm not going to read it because the next slide is a pictorial representation of what the difference is between I and double I. But it's important to understand that what separation distance and how you calculate your groundwater value is based on the depth of groundwater, the capillary zone, and the distance between those in the structure. If we look at shallow groundwater, the assumptions are that it's less than or equal to 0, that one of those is less than or equal to 0, that we have direct diffusion into the indoor air, that the building is constructed of a concrete block or poured wall, and we use the values, or we use the equations in 2713A and 2713B. If it's groundwater, we would be looking at that those values both have a separation distance greater than 0, that again the basement is concrete, or that the foundation is concrete block or poured wall, and those values are calculated by using rule 2713A alone. So going over to the Excel, and going over to the calculator, we can put in values, and you'll also notice that it all includes all the most common units. So if you log in meters or centimeters, it allows you to do it. But because the equations do everything in meters and centimeters, it automatically does that conversion for you. So the calculator automatically makes those conversions for you. But you can see where, if we change this to sand, because it has a low vertical, has a low cap zone, we change this to 9.5, you can see that if we looked at 27.1 with double I, you can see that the way that it figures the vertical separation distance has a negative, so we would calculate that value using the shallow groundwater method. Whereas for a slab on grade, it would calculate it using the other method. You can also look at it from, just to show you that it's more of a factor of the foundation type, you can see that it still occurs for a slab on grade for a basement, that we would use different methods. But it automatically does the math. It shows you what the difference is so that you can identify why those values are changing or why they are not. So the calculator will provide additional clarity. We've talked about how the form's complete or not complete, but it also identifies the method that we're using to calculate the groundwater, as well as it identifies the rules. So if we go through it again, now you can see that the form is complete for the VI Tier 2 and the VI Tier 3A. It says it. You can also see for the proposed rules which rules we would use to calculate the value. It's clearly identified in the box as well as in the columns on the left. And you can see that if we did not have it fully completed, you would see that the form was switched to not complete. It would also does checks that would verify if we used the wrong input values, because there's values for non-residential and residential. It identifies errors where they're at. It tells you that the form's not complete for the VI Tier 3A. So if you looked at the results tab, you get a bunch of NAs where it can't fill it out. So if we go back to, we'll switch this just down to non-residential. I'm trying not to go too quickly with the clicks. And we'll go back to the PowerPoint. At the end, this is the output screen and what you have. This is more of an abbreviated list, but you can see that part of the reason why we require that you put in it is because every site's going to be possibly different. We want to make sure that it's clear on every page what site you did this information for, when you did it will be clearly identified, and the information you put in. So based on this information, it tells you what kind of information you need to include in the report and document to show that your conditions are appropriate. So to give you kind of a peek behind the scenes and not really make your head spin, but one of the things we know that we will have questions on is how does it look in the Excel format. So we wanted to show you the Johnson-Enger model, which is identified in Rule 2713A. It comes out of the US EPA 2004 User Guide Report. This equation in the language, as well as using the PECLET for the dimensionless group, which is identified in this area. But Rule 2713A says that when this group, right, is the PECLET number, and as that group approaches infinity, then you would need to do a different method, which is identified as being this series of equations. So long story short, if we read Rule 2713A, it says you need to do this series of equations or this series of equations, depending on whether the PECLET number reaches infinity. The way you would see that, and this is where I know it will make some people's head spin, but the way you would see that in the Excel formula is it reads like this. And you can see I kind of color-coded it to make it a little bit easier. But if there's an error, basically because it reaches infinity, you'd run this. If not, you'd run this. So you can see that it would actually reach out and pull all those values to run. So here's the Johnson-Enger model again. When you go to that cell, it actually will reach out to all the different cells in the calculator tab and pull those values. It also identifies if it has to pull values from prime values from other tables. So that's where I'll turn it over to Shane for a minute to talk about some exceptions.
Yeah, so these are some complicating factors that we wanted to go over more for awareness, but I want to make a point that I'm talking to those people who kind of want to do this by hand, because the calculator is going to go through all these complicating factors. It's going to do it for you. But if you are going through the equations by hand, double checking the values, these are some things to be aware of as you do so. Footnote DD lists a bunch of developmental hazardous substances. This is a subset from that footnote, and it's going to apply to more pathways than just Rule 27, the VIAP, but that's what we're focused on today. So for today, I want to highlight that there's inhalation exposure column here, and you'll either see SE or FT, and that is single event or full term. And when it's a single event, that may trigger you to do something else based on Rule 27, sub Rule 3. You'll also see that there's some other little footnotes in here. This number 1, and down here, that speaks to when we're thinking about non-residential values, that some hazardous substances we can adjust for a 12-hour workday, and some we can't. And this just for transparency shows you which ones we're considering that for. Footnote EE lists a bunch of acceptable air concentrations for both residential and non-residential scenarios. And the values are actually listed in this footnote because they're not calculated based on the equations of Rule 27. If you see a value here for residential or non-residential, they may not be the same as is the case for chloridane. You would use that value as the health-based value in the equations. And this, in terms of footnote EE, this would apply to all the different parts of the VIAP, the groundwater, shallow groundwater, soil, and vapor. There are references that I didn't include on this page for where these values come from, and those are going to be in the footnote in the rule. You'll be able to find it there. I just pulled out the non-residential reference here for the 12-hour workday. Again, some of these we can adjust, and some of them we won't be able to adjust. Footnote FF is very similar to footnote EE in that it's showing less than chronic exposure values or short-term values. But footnote FF only applies to where we have shallow groundwater. So when you have shallow groundwater, these would be the AACs that you would use for these particular hazardous substances for both residential and non-residential scenarios. But you would not use them in the same scenario for soil or vapor calculations. Oop, wrong way. Rounding. Rounding is something that I've talked to several people about that have already delved into these calculations by hand. We don't round any parameters or outputs from successive equations. They're all calculated or all carried forward without rounding until the final criteria or screening level is determined. And that is then rounded to two significant figures. If you end up rounding too heavily throughout the process, because we round to two significant figures at the end, the values may be slightly different. And this is kind of an example of that, where I've maybe rounded one particular value more heavily than somebody would. I rounded it to two significant figures, this particular value here. But like I said, a lot of the rounding issue that comes up is when you do rounding throughout the entire process. But you can see in this middle column, we have our standard rounding procedures where nothing was rounded until the very end. But when I round this one value, we do get slight differences. And you're not going to see it all the time. It's just based on where the significant digits fall out. So just one thing to be aware of when you're going forward by hand. So the issue of groundwater, when you have a site where you have groundwater that is not shallow, so it's actually deeper groundwater, there are some hazardous substances where we will actually default to the shallow groundwater value, and that's based on how we calculate those particular values. It goes back to some of the chemical physical properties and how much is actually able to volatilize. And as the current rule stands, it only affects these 4 hazardous substances, but there is rule language and Rule 27, Subrule 9 that speaks to this. But as of right now, it's only affecting these 4 hazardous substances.
So one thing we wanted to do again before we got to the questions was actually to go back, because we may have flipped through it a little bit quick, and actually show you maybe a little bit again how the calculator works. So I'm just going to clear out the tabs of what we put in before and then show you the output screen and how it looks. But we can go through then, and whatever our site is, we could put the actual depth to groundwater. If it's 20 feet, we can do that. We are allowed to, it identifies the units for you and does all the automatic conversions into centimeters and meters for you. So we can change it quickly. It's easy to do. We would be able to get that information based on our wells. If we did the soil type and we knew in the field we classified it according to the USDA, we could choose our soil type. And the county, right? We should all know where our site is. We'd be able to put in the soil so that we can get the right temperature, the system temp. If we're looking at a VI Tier 3A and we have uses other than residential, or maybe we don't have for a residential use, maybe we have a house that only has a slab on grade, we can actually put that value in there and you can see where it carries over. One of the important things that it does then is it automatically will calculate those out. You can see the VI Tier 1 is already out there, and these are just identified from the rules. And you can see how that those changes may impact each successive tier, and whether it impacts the soil, groundwater. So if we go back to the question screen and we stay with sand, right? One important thing to note is if we haven't changed anything in our assumptions and the VI Tier 2 is the same as the VI Tier 3A, one of the questions we get a lot is why didn't anything change? And that's because the math doesn't change. You can see in this table all 3 values are the same. That things are not going to change for your VI Tier 3A until we start having differences, till we start changing the use, till we start changing the structure, possibly the foundation type. so that we get, when we look at the results tab again, we will see changes. And here you can see the difference between VI Tier 2 and VI Tier 3A, because we go from being a basement to a slab on grade. It also incorporates automatically the non-residential land use, the bigger building, and the bigger air exchange. So we have those, and you can see how those change. One thing to point out is the table, just like in the proposed rules, identifies the basis. It'll also give you the footnotes that are appropriate, that are identified in the rules, but it gives you the basis, whether it's a carcinogenic, a non-carcinogenic, or a short term. It identifies all those for you in the tables and when it prints out. The printout will also have what your assumptions were, so you can keep track of it, and your site name and information. But one question that we get in the proposed rules a lot is that this tool should help is when you have multiple soil types on a site, is this tool will allow you to do the sensitivity analysis. So if we have done methods where we have multiple different soil types on a site, and we wanted to evaluate all the different soil types we have, by just changing it, the results will automatically update and be modified as we go through it. So it does help with completing that sensitivity analysis. So today, I'm not sure how many questions we have, but if we don't get to your questions today, like Jim said, we'll try to get to them later or get you some information, because we do have, if you submitted it, we will make sure that we respond back to it. One important note is to make sure that you guys understand is that these are for the proposed rules. These are not for the current criteria. The methodology that we use is similar to what we use is the same for the site specific that we do. But what we're talking about today is the proposed rules. And this is a tool for the proposed rules and the VI tiered process, and is not for the current rules.
Okay. So, all right, thanks Matt and Shane. We did get a few questions that have come in while you were talking, and we're kind of going through those and looking at them. Before we go through questions, I do want to ask a couple of poll questions for everybody. And the first thing we want to ask is, just going to help us gauge how well we're doing, is has the presentation increased your understanding of the calculator that you just went through? So take a quick minute to answer that. And while you're doing that, I want to remind everybody, and I can't remember if I said this at the beginning, but if you look under the handouts tab on your toolbar there, you'll see copies of today's presentation along with a copy of the rules. So you can find those under the handouts tab if you joined us, after we got started and you didn't hear me announce that earlier or get my email yesterday. Okay, very good. Looks like a lot of people have said it has increased their understanding, so that's good. Nice job, guys. The next question is just some basic logistical things here, and that's, we'd like to know how many people are watching this webinar at your location. We know a lot of people watch it in groups, so this just gives us a better idea of how many people have watched the webinar or are watching the webinar right now. Okay, and looks like most people have responded, so I'm going to close this right now. All right, Matt, so I think you got a couple questions right there in front of you. Do you have one there you want to go over?
So if you do submit your questions, we will try to answer them. We're trying to group them because we have some of them that are similar. So we're trying to group the questions. So you may hear your question worded a little bit differently, but we're trying to answer as many people as we can in the time that we have allotted. And so the first question I have in front of me right now is, what happens when no groundwater is present? How do we handle sites that have groundwater that is not affected and soil contamination only? So I think that that's actually two questions. One is, what happens when no groundwater is present? So when you have no groundwater present, and we can go back to the calculator, the groundwater values on the results table, you have nothing to compare to. So those values, the proposed rules say for the appropriate criteria, if you don't have groundwater, for the appropriate media, there would be nothing to compare to. Because it doesn't change any of the other values, one of the things that you could do is just put down to the depth you know. So if we only know to 10 feet, we can use that as what our investigation included to, and it would adjust that groundwater to that depth. So that would be one of the things you can do. How do you handle the site where groundwater is not affected and soil contamination only? Again, if your groundwater is below the screening value, the VI Tier 1, that would show that you do not have a vapor source. And then you can concentrate on the soil and the vapor results. Other questions as they're coming in is when will the tool be available? What we talked about, we were hoping actually to have it sooner, but we are going to send an update to everybody that is part of the webinar in 2 weeks in 1 week to give them an update on the status of where it's at and when we hope to have it released. And we will make sure that when that email goes out that we give you the schedule if we're not able to release it at that point. Will it be available prior to closure of the comment period? Again, that answers that same question that we do hope to have it out before then. We are working hard to get it out. There has been some technical things that we have had to work through to make sure that people can use it as a screening or as an evaluation of the proposed rules that we're working through. And Excel tends to not be the most user-friendly for a lot of computers, and we're working through those. Next question. Questions. So this is a question that is not specifically about the calculator, but why did the DEQ choose the USDA soil classification system? And this is one that we've talked about in some of our outreach that we've done. The USDA, you'll see that many other of the states around the Great Lakes are using the USDA soil classification system, in part because of the ability to get consistent results, and in part because when you look at the Table 1 in Rule 7 that has all the inputs for the soil classification systems, it exists for the USDA. It does not exist for other soil types. So for existing projects where soil sampling has been complete, there are other PowerPoints that we have. We can send you additional information, but if you look at the work done the question is, why can't the DEQ come up with a conversion from the USCS to the USDA? The answer to that is, and we can provide you the references, if you look at what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did for a comparison survey, they compared hundreds of samples between the two classification systems and established very conclusively that there is no correlation between the two. So that there is no way to correlate between one and the other, especially when we were talking about trying to make it for generic criteria that are applicable and that everybody would get the same answer for. So it's going to be important to use the USDA classification system. I think it's important to understand, though, that the historical data will be able to help guide us in what the soil type is. There are other tools that are out there that will also help in that guidance, such as the USDA Soil Classification Survey page identifies on a very wide range of across the state what you can expect the range of soil types to be on your site. So those will help guide whether, if we can identify what soil type on our site is, we'd be able to do the sensitivity analysis to see how much, if any, change that would mean for us. What background is required to show field methods for soil contamination are correct? So what background? I'm assuming what the question is what kind of information would they have to contain in a report? That's one of the things that we will provide further guidance on. A brief summary would be, we would expect to see that the proper soil classifications used in the boring logs, and that you can identify that you've followed one of the approaches that allow you to classify the sites into the USDA soil classification system. The normal documentation that you would have in the report would be the same. So as we're getting other questions, I do see one about why there was limited discussion for the screening distance for petroleum hydrocarbons. That is because the calculator does not address the petroleum vertical screening distances. Those would have to be applied after we have the information. They are identified in the rules. It is just not anything that the calculator will tell you. It's an alternate demonstration of compliance, and there is you need the information to do it, and this is very similar to the EPAs and other calculators. They do not apply the petroleum vertical or lateral separation distances in the calculator. They apply it once you have the data and you can use it for the cross sections in the map.
Did you address this, Matt? What happens? Please discuss what to do once you complete the form and discuss what happens from there. So once you go through the Excel spreadsheet and the data and everything like that, what do you expect from that?
So if a party if after the proposed rules have been passed, party completes the calculator, they have the site data that they have that can make those modifications. They would be able to make those modifications on the calculator, use those values as appropriate in the report, but the report should identify how they made those decisions. And they should be able to document, for instance, if groundwater is 10 feet, how they came to the conclusion in the report that they did, the depth of groundwater of 10 feet is appropriate. If it's a non-residential use, they should be able to document that, as well as how they had determined which soil type they used.
Okay. Here's one, is if the groundwater is impacted in only the lower depth with clean upper level groundwater, how is that handled?
Well, that's not a question for the calculator, which is what we're talking about today. That'd be a question about making that demonstration through the report and how your vapor source is not likely to produce vapors.
Okay. Going through a couple other questions. Some of them are pretty specific, so they might be things that people want to talk directly to you about. Just trying to fill out a couple of these.
Yep,
will the tool be a downloadable file? If not, please describe the proposed access. So how do you intend to send this out?
Well, in the short term, we're looking at hopefully making it as a downloadable file. Longer term, what we're hoping to do is actually make it a web-based application that you can go online, fill in your information, and then be able to print it from that web-based application.
And can we start using this calculator immediately when it comes out instead of requesting SSTLs from the DEQ?
No, you still need to request that. The calculator, when it comes out, the reason why we're producing it is to help people understand how the VI tier process that's being proposed works, how the different changes on their site conditions will impact those values, and other things like that. But they will not be pre-approved site-specific criteria. You still would need to go through the TOX unit to get that approval.
Okay. Can depth to groundwater be input if the only data are obtained from GeoPro borings versus actual wells?
I think that's something that is going to have to be dealt with the district on what you know on your site and what the impact is. If your depth of groundwater is 20 feet and you have that in a geoprobe, there's going to be a little difference. There's going to be a little impact. But if you're looking at a depth of groundwater where you switch between one method and another, the most accurate way to identify that depth of groundwater is through a well. And so having that information is going to be important as you go through it.
Well, the well log says 10 feet, but actually it's 8 or 7.
A lot of times we've seen historic where we have seen well logs that have identified groundwater at 10 feet, and yet when we put in a well, we see it at much shallower depths that could be 8, 7, or even 6 feet. So having a well, if you look online, that's the proper way, and you talk to most geologists, that's the proper way to identify what the depth of groundwater is at your site.
Okay. Is there an opportunity to modify building air exchange rates in the calculator?
There is an opportunity to modify building air exchange rates under the proposed rules, but not in the calculator. The calculator implements the generic criteria, both restricted and unrestricted. If you are going to modify the building air exchange rate, the proposed rules allow you to do that, but it is site specific. So I think that that's a key thing that we have to stress is you can make those modifications, but the proposed rules or the proposed calculator tool is not going to do that. We want to keep it where it's just the generic criteria.
But there are pre-approved air exchange rates that do change between residential and non-residential use.
As well as, as well as building types too. So like we showed as the example early on, there is different air exchange rates for a building less than 50,000 square feet and a building greater than 50,000 square feet.
Okay. How do we handle multiple soil layers? For example, clay layer over sand layer, which one is applied?
So that is actually addressed in the proposed rules, and that's where we talked about using the sensitivity analysis. You could use this calculator tool to evaluate it and determine which soil type you would use. The rules still allow you to do a multi-layer model if you choose, but again, that would be site specific.
Okay. Shouldn't we assume that all buildings or future buildings will be built on top of at least 1 foot of sand above native materials, and therefore sand should always be used as a USDA soil texture?
And that is something that you would have to look at. Not all buildings are built with 1 foot. You'd have to look at the sensitivity analysis, where the contamination is, how it migrates to the building. There are other things to consider as you do it. That's one of the things that we will clarify out as we with the proposed rules and other guidance material.
Okay. Sorry, which?
Well, one question that I see up there is, will various runs of the calculator be stored in a central state database? That is not the intent at this point. The intent is to provide it as a tool that people can implement and use.
Okay, I've got time for a couple more questions here, then we're going to have to wrap it up. Can we use non-residential Tier 3A numbers without implementing a land use restriction?
Most of the time, if
No.
right, the answer is no. And what I was trying to say is, because you've gone from residential to non-residential land use, so you will have different use restrictions that you have to put in there.
Okay. Here's one. When will the rules be promulgated?
Right now, we're going through this part of the information that we're trying to put out to help the rule promulgation process, the information that's out there.
Yeah, edit.
So, and I'll let Josh.
Yeah, so we have to go through the rules promulgation process. The timeline out there for how the process works is on one of the, I guess, the prerequisite. Should be in the prerequisite presentation that we provided, and the timeline to get it through public comment period, through the rules promulgation period, and through the joint committee on administrative rules with the legislature, and hopefully that can take anywhere up to 6 months to a year. So we can't predict it. It's taken as long as 18 months in the past. It just really depends. But our goal is to get it to the legislature in the process yet this year.
So, for people that didn't know, want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. This is Josh Mosier, Acting Assistant Division Director of RD.
All right, thanks, Josh. So it's 2 o'clock. That's the end time of our webinar. We did get a lot of questions that came in, and I apologize if we didn't get to your specific question. We had to kind of ferret through them and answer as many as we could. You got the slide up there that shows who to go to with questions. So if something you really need to get addressed wasn't addressed, you can email, looks like Matt or Shane here, and they'll try their best to get back with you as soon as possible. Again, we collect all this data, and we're going to look through it, and a lot of stuff helps us as well in terms of the questions that were asked today. If you didn't hear me before, the handouts tab has got the handouts for today's webinar, so if you want to quickly go grab those, you can. In terms of what's going to happen after this, about an hour, you're going to get an evaluation automated email, and it's going to basically talk about, it's going to basically go through and ask you a bunch of survey questions from the webinar, and if you would, please fill it out. We'd really appreciate it because it's going to help us. As far as the recording goes, we did record the webinar and we'll post it online probably next week. If there is people out there who are professional engineers and you want to get credit for the webinar, we will be sending a link out with a certificate to get credit for it. I don't know, Matt or Shane, do you guys have anything else you want to add before we sign off today?
Nope, I'm set.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we did want to wrap this up in an hour, so I thank you all for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.